reverse of his previous statement, right? So you have this. Now I'm trying to
I like how you highlight, because I didn't think of it as an image of him going up to him with an empty bowl, asking Joshu, the question that he's like, have you eaten your right porridge?
So rice is the plain old staple. Everyone knows about it. No one necessarily likes it, but it's the food of the gods.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Not Zen, where we talk about Zen, whatnot, and occasionally what's not. Today we're looking at the sayings of Yunmen, saying 211 from the translator Ers App, I think so you pronounce it. We have a total of 4 guests today, kind of a smaller cast. Starting with me, I'm Jim, I'm your host, and going to B. Rye Johnson.
That's just me showing you kind of how a bad boy I am, and I'll say bad boy stuff.
You want a leather jacket?
Yeah, it's 6 foot. It's 6 feet long, but I'm only 5'2".
Thank you, Brian. Next up, we have Kev.
Hi, how are you all doing today? Thanks for listening in. I'm Kev.
Very pretty. Nice. You sound like a singer, Kevin. You have a very nice voice.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right. Don't get too inflated. All right. Aaron, I almost forgot your name. I almost called you Zero.
Hi guys, how you doing?
Very good. And today, again, we're looking at the sayings of Yunmen, number 211, translated by Ers App. You can get this on Amazon, and I would recommend it because not enough people have bought it, and it is a great translation. And Yunmen's cool.
Book. There's a lot of biographical information in there, etc. And he lays it out kind of like, here's what Yunmen says about this. Here's what Yunmen says about this. A little bit of that, not a lot of that, but some of it's kind of lame. But a lot of it's great.
That's pretty cool. Some funny antics with the monks. Also, as a side note, when we're doing sayings, the episodes tend to be a little bit shorter because there's not much or as much to bite into as the Blue Cliff Record or the Mumonkan, because those are longer and more.
What he means by that, for the listener, is usually we're doing something out of one of the collections of cases, like the Blue Cliff Record or the Gateless Gate, Moonkin, or the Book of Serenity or Equanimity, which you may have heard of. And those books are collections of koans. And what's cool about them is they're collected by Zen masters from when Zen was like ripe in China, when it was cool. Like, these are the guys we look up to. So it's not like modern people found these koans, translated, and then put them together. We're translating actual books that Zen masters, quote unquote, kind of wrote about these koans. And then, so there's a lot of commentary on them by classic Zen masters and stuff. We talk about them. These saying texts are taken from different biographies and different anthologies in collections, and are just snippets. So there's no Zen master commentary on them or anything. They're just the circulated story themselves for the most part. So there'll be less conversation. If there is less conversation, it would be because there's just less literal words here.
Yeah, I will say, if when you read some of the collected works like the Blue Cliff Record or the Mumonkan, because there's so many Zen masters involved, you don't always get the feeling of the Zen masters that are being quoted, per se. So Yunmen is in the BCR a lot, and the Mumonkan, I'm pretty sure. And I think what's nice about these sayings texts is it's kind of one-on-one with you and the ZM. So in this case, it's just you and Yunmen for, I don't know, 400 pages? Something like that. 200. Wow, I was way off. But yeah, anyway, does anyone want to read the... Thank you, Brian, by the way. Does anyone want to read the sayings case koan thing?
Yeah, sure, I'd like to. Yunmen happens to be my favorite Zen master. Today we're going to be reading saying 211, and it's relatively short. It goes like this. Once the master said, "There is nothing whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching. Striking the bell, or beating the drum is no exception. If this is the case, nothing will be, parenthetical, Buddhist teaching, and nothing will not be. He added, one should not assert that when one speaks, it is, parenthetical, the Buddhist teaching, and that when one doesn't speak, it isn't. Even what I just said has not quite made it. Well, as long as it benefits people, it may be okay. So I just want to mention the parenthetical statements. Those are usually things that a translator adds to make the case more understandable in English, but those words directly Buddhist teaching might not have been present in the original Chinese that this is translated from. It just seems to be something like this would be the implication of that was in Chinese, so they do the parenthetical to make it clear.
It's like a context that's implied, but somehow not clear or something. It's weird and it happens a lot, and I really like that they do it because the square brackets in modern stuff means like you've added it, right?
Yeah.
Paraphrasing.
So it made the reading a little bumbly, but I felt it was important.
It's kind of a, it's just kind of a string of sentences. Each one works off the next. So see if we can just make it easy. So master, it's all in one master, even though there's two kind of parts. It sounds like two Zen masters are talking, I think, a little bit, but it's just one Zen master. It's just all Yunmen. There's no monk in this story, and there's no other Zen master. It's all him. So he's answering some question or giving some teaching, and he says, there is nothing whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching. And he says these, striking the bell, beating the drum, those all count. There's no exception. And that means nothing will be and nothing will not be parenthetical to Buddhist teaching. Everything's the Buddhist teaching, and nothing cannot be the Buddhist teaching, etc. But he gives kind of a second paragraph in me, but he says, one should not assert that when one speaks it, it is the Buddhist teaching, that when one doesn't speak it, it isn't. So he says one should not, when you're talking about the Buddhist teaching, you shouldn't assume it's the Buddhist teaching, and that when you're not talking about it, you shouldn't assume it isn't. And then he even gives another disclaimer and says, well, that's not even quite right either. Go ahead, James.
I was just going to say it almost reminds me when I start talking and realize I don't know what I'm saying. And I kind of cover my own tracks, and I'm like, well, you know what? Never mind.
We won't get too much into the rest of the Yunmen book, but that is a thing with Yunmen. There's the time where he walked up on the whole story is he walked up on the pulpit and he says, I'm compromised. And then he walks off the pulpit, right? He kind of backed out of the situation. He was just having a bad day, for whatever reason. He's like, today's not the day that I'm going to teach you. And we have other, that makes you think to ramble even more. We have other Zen masters that speak of silence or get up and give silent sermons. How much of those are actually are not mystical, weird, spooky things, but closer to what Yunmen did, right? It's like, I cannot talk right now. I'm not quite sure. It's just something to think about. And we've got in the Blue Cliff record, Wangbo, and our listeners might know, but a pretty common Zen line that we talk about is there are no Zen masters in China. And Huangbo says that. And then in the commentary, the Yanwu, the Zen master who's commenting on that line, actually says he said that because he didn't know what else to say and he was backing out of the question because the monk was being too harsh on him. It's kind of funny. So yeah, and that's a narrative. It's a normal thing within these stories. That it's kind of cool to see it play out here as James did in this kind of stream of conscious, this, actually, maybe not that, maybe this kind of thing.
I like that you brought up the Hongbo anecdote, because doesn't it go something like there are no teachers of Zen in China, but I didn't say that there's no Zen?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a good,
yeah. And in between that, a monk had asked a really good question. He's like, well, what about all the teachers then? And then And then the commenter says that Huangbo was kind of taken aback and just couldn't answer the question very well. So he finds out this tricky way to answer it.
Yeah. I did like that because I wanted to touch on the first two sentences, especially to someone who might be new to Zen. It's kind of a weird thing, or Buddhism. So there is nothing whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching. That's a weird sentence. And it kind of reminds me of there are no Zen teachers, but there is Zen. In a weird way, I guess. And then right after, striking the bell or beating the drum is no exception. So it's kind of ubiquitous, this whole Zen thing.
That first part, there's nothing whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching. It kind of reminds me of that notion of like nothing holy. That there wouldn't be like as like an object of something in the world. It's like there is no thing in the world that would be holy, that would be a holy object or teaching of Buddhism.
Holy sort of means like better than the other one, and maybe it's not
Yeah.
that like no one teaches it, but it's just like everything equally expresses the Dharma.
Right, and he kind of gets at that idea too, right? Because if this is the case, nothing will be and nothing will not be. Everything is sort of equalized in that way.
Right, and I imagine it's a good way to deflate some of these monks carrying around sutras.
The next line is interesting. He says, striking the bell or beating the drum is no exception. So there's a reason why to these monks or to us or to the reader of his times, pick your choice, he has to make that disclaimer. Right? So it says there's nothing whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching. Some monk is then going to think, we assume, well, what about striking the bell? What about the beating the drum? So there's a reason why he had to specifically say those two metaphors and why they are also like involved in this Buddhist teachings.
Does anyone know the cultural context there? I can only think of at the end of, a sermon or a meditation sesh that a bell would be rung or a drum would be hit before
Could even
breakfast.
be the beginning to like it's about sound, and it brings you to the present moment, and then it's like, hey, even when it's something about it or it's this symbol that's bigger than it, like there's this complex symbol, even that's the Dharma, right? It's still just another, this isn't excluded.
Right. If we took that way, where in either one of those scenarios, so you get striking the bell and beating the drum, they're both audible things which communicate something to a group of people don't want to communicate with words. So that's going to be a case of either it needs to be loud, like beating the drum, so you're calling people from the field. It needs to be calm and relaxed, like striking the bell. Or, striking the bell, there's the dinner bell, which is also works because it's a high pitched, when it carries higher frequencies will carry further better. So that one can go the way. But yeah, so you have these two metaphors which are sounds that are used to communicate with people about specific things, with them either like coming or leaving, right? The thing being done or the thing starting. So you could kind of think of maybe it's the teaching of the day, or maybe it's the daily meditation, or maybe it's time to plant the beets, or something. If it's the teaching, that explains the Buddhist teaching, right? Does that work? Would a monk be thinking that is there reason to say that the daily teaching doesn't explain the Buddhist teaching? Why does he make that disclaimer?
The way that striking the bell and beating the drum is phrased is also interesting. Because he doesn't say to strike the bell, he says striking. It's an action. Striking the bell, beating the drum.
Oh, like even as a response, something that's meant as a symbol, not an answer, sort of like this enigmatic Zen answer, hitting someone with a stick. But I feel like that by default people already think that enigma-ness, sort of that non-verbalness communicates the Dharma. So I don't know why it's being emphasized that that's not excluded.
When you said that, Kevin, I thought about when you're in an action, you're in an action. You can't really escape it. So that's what came to mind.
Remember, and we've done this one on the podcast. Remember the Su Feng's grain of rice?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He specifically uses the phrase, "I'll beat the drum" to call everyone to look. So I think, drum, if we're going kind of the way that we're talking about with how Kevin just spoke, or, it's actual beating of the drum. Calling people to look, beating the drum, calling people to look is also explaining the Buddhist teaching.
Right, and there's also kind of you just go off loose associations. Beating the drum's pretty violent, or loud,
Right.
percussive.
Everybody
The bell's much
there
more
and look.
gentle.
That's supposed to be
Right.
God Zen.
And like you said, you like when you're doing it, you're in the action.
Right.
And if we sort of take that back to the first sentence, then you could say there is no action whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching, or there's no being in action whatsoever that does not explain the teaching.
Anything you do explains the Buddhist teaching.
Yeah.
If that goes in line, you can say if it doesn't.
Yeah. I also with the drumming again, I think of like musicians, and maybe Kevin or Brian, you'll be able to speak to this, but I don't want to. I feel a little bit ambivalent about trying to use this as a way to talk about Zen. But when you're beating a drum, or playing an instrument for an audience, there's almost kind of a call and response, or you can't help but hear the instrument. I don't know what I'm trying to get at exactly, but
You can't ignore it.
you can't ignore
Talking
it.
about between the listener and the musician, or
Yeah, and I don't want to say they become one or something like that, but I want to dance around something about the give and take, and how it happens like that, right? It's not like here you are, and then they accept it or not. Like you said, Kevin, it just it's there.
right when you see the horns, it's an ox immediately. You don't have to think about it. Alternatively, I also really am interested in and keep meaning to put some thought into this, or write something about how Zen masters use sound and what that means to us and our brains, right? Because sound metaphor happens a lot, and a couple other types of metaphor, but sound is one as well. And sound is the metaphor that sound is where do you hear sound, right? In your brain, in your head, right? It's the thing that's the easiest to tell that the physical world, that there's some sort of happening within your brain, like it's being processed inside of your head. When you see something, you're measuring distance and stuff, and it's a little easier to say. But the sounds and stuff, you hear because your ears are so close to your brain, and then it's like vibrating through your skull. It's a very central head thing.
I was going to say that in a way, it's actually really intimate, like sound itself. You kind of think of, and I don't mean that like the notes are making you feel a certain way. I just mean the physiology. And for example, if people usually think of like physical touch as the most sensual thing you can experience, when sound is just as close as touch. Does that make sense? And yet it's everywhere at once.
Well, think about walking through the jungle at night, right? And it's going to be one of our most important senses, and especially one that builds community. We can go to the Jungle Book and talk about the law of the jungle. The law of the jungle is when if you're listening and you announce yourself in the dark, you're okay, you're protected, you can go wherever you want. But when you're quiet and you're hunting, that's when community breaks down. I don't know where I'm going with that. It's just a great book by a racist. But sound is interesting, and I like to think about it whenever it's brought up in cases.
Yeah. Now that you mention it, sound is, you could definitely write something about it, because it's such an interesting, such a paradoxical tool. Sort of, I don't know if I have the language for it, but it's interesting that Zen uses it so much, because you have ideas like Zen isn't the written word. It's not even the spoken word, but yet it's a meme that's constantly used. And so they're always warning you about, putting phrases in a skin hat, a skin bag, or something like that. And yet, they use sound a lot. So it's interesting. I don't know.
Well, he goes on to talk more about sounds, so let's use that transition. After he talks about the striking the bell or beating the drum, also it, and that nothing will be and nothing will not be it. He also says, one should not assert that when one speaks, it is it. That when one doesn't speak, it isn't.
I think the keyword's assert. Right? If there's nothing whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching, then you don't need to assert anything. Otherwise, we could just flip that. One should not assert that when one speaks, it is the Buddhist teaching, and that when one doesn't speak, it isn't. So basically, you could read that as, well, when someone doesn't speak, they could be teaching you it, and when someone's speaking, it's not necessarily a teaching.
Yeah, when it's not sound that is the teaching, and silence not the teaching.
Say it one more time.
It is not sound that is the teaching, and silence not the teaching. So we could just change that sentence from speaks to sound. One should not assert that a sound is the Buddhist teaching, and that when there is no sound, it isn't. Instead of speaks here. Going back to the sound analogy. Which is sort of to say, it's not a requirement that there be speaking in order for the Dharma to be explained.
It sounds to me like he's covering a lot of ground for monks. A lot of, he's kind of looking for the pitfalls of what he said at first, and then he's kind of covering his ground. Like I said at the beginning. It's kind of like when you have an argument and then as you're saying it, and this is what goes through my head a lot, I start making counter arguments for exactly what I'm saying. I try to add additional statements to cover my bases.
There's another angle we could take at this. Let's say there's two people communicating, and let's say we're in the modern day world and we're hanging out, and someone asks someone, what is the highest of the holy truths? Something. Why did Bodhidharma come from the West? Which for the listener are just kind of classical starters that a lot of these Zen masters use to test people's enlightenment. And what if he doesn't say anything? So the guy doesn't have an answer, for whatever reason. Yunmen could be saying here, when one should not assert that when one speaks, it is the Buddhist teaching, and when one doesn't speak, it isn't. Which maybe brings us back to the striking the bell or the beating the drum in a more appropriate way. Because if we're thinking about beating the drum as, calling people to you, this action which is not beholden to the thought of the Buddhist teaching, is maybe what someone might call egotistical, calling people to you, beating the drum. But when someone does the opposite, you shouldn't say that isn't it.
Sounds like it's pretty easy to be a Zen master.
Well, yeah, that's not a Zen master, but at least to, explain the Buddhist teaching.
Yeah, interesting.
No.
So are we explaining the Buddhist teaching right now?
If I saw your
I saw your eyes roll, Jim. Rolling your eyes or speaking. No exception.
Forget Zen. If there's a conversation that's happening and one person's not speaking, and that's disrupting the conversation, then We can't say that the not speaking is disrupting the conversation. It's whoever thought the conversation was disrupted from the not speaking.
And you could hurt a lot of people's feelings with that.
Well, you're going to meet a lot of people who want you to talk, who want you to say this and want you to say that, and answer in this way and answer in that way. And you're going to meet a million people who are going to rate what you say based on, the answer they have in their own head.
Yeah, it's, in a weird way, it's a good. You can make it into a commentary about having good boundaries. Not necessarily answering everyone's existential woes or general woes.
To take another angle, along the same lines, let's disregard the idea of not saying something on purpose and just stammering. That brings us right back to the very beginning of what we were talking about, where we brought up Huang Bo and people like that who at times, fell back the conversation. Or Yunmen himself, who went up to the pulpit and said, "I'm compromised." Did he not, don't assert that he didn't do the Buddhist teaching. And he went up to the pulpit and didn't say anything.
Yeah,
it's not, it's not weird and mystical. These people just backed out of the conversation.
Right, yeah. But it displaces the object, so to speak. So the Zen master being the object of teaching or getting enlightened, and then he fucks up, tells you so. It's like, well, where does that expectation get displaced to? I'm trying to put myself in the monk's position, seeing something like that and not making it into a mystical thing, but then accepting it as it is. Zen masters are human. Then what the fuck is this Zen thing? That they're barely teaching us, that they fail over and over by their own estimate.
Yeah, isn't it Yunmen who also says, "For why do you put on the 7-piece robe?"
Yeah.
At the sound of a bell, nonetheless.
I really wanted to bring this up. Dan said, I don't know if sometimes he just says shit off the cuff and it's really good. And he doesn't seem to remember it.
You've quoted Dan a few times being like, "Oh, I think a Zen master said this, but actually Dan just said it." I never get in there quick enough to say it. Also, how do you say something like that? Like, excuse me, Dan did not say that.
Yeah.
I think it's funny on both of your ends that he's so good at communicating. He's great at communicating, and then you're great at picking it up and bringing it into new context. Fun.
Yeah, and it's funny that he forgets, because if I ever said anything clever, I remember it for weeks. So he's so saturated that he forgets all the time. But he said, we were talking about how things kind of answer themselves, or questions contain the answers. And he said, when you strike the bell, that's the question being asked, and the bell ringing is the answer. So it's such a nice, contained, instant kind of answer. And that kind of reminds me, there's something similar going on here. Striking the bell or beating the drum is no exception. Kind of getting back to me talking about the action. You're kind of stuck in the action. It's kind of contained. Yeah. That was more relevant earlier, but we kind of moved on, so.
All kind of wraps up together, at least all from these angles we've approached it.
I think with the sayings case, you draw all these associations, and it's difficult you could feel the web, but to make it plain and simple without, say, something like the BCR, where you just talk about it for a while, and then you read the notes on it, and you're like, oh, well, my association's, close to the mark because the Zen master's talking about this. And so you draw all these associations, but then they're verified by the notes themselves. So we don't have that luxury in the saying.
We got to think the Blue Cliff Record was an actual book written, right? So everything that's written as paragraphs, sentences, and chapters and presented, in the order it is written to be read. And the saying texts are more collections to be commented on and stuff, which was a popular thing that happened in China. Especially the Zen tradition took over big time of just bringing up popular stories and commenting on them over and over through different different ages, even hundreds of years apart. But yeah, it is different. And then, but the other books are intentional. You know, the books are going to lead you places that the author feels relevant. You know, so it sure is a different thing for sure.
Yeah, you almost have more freedom in the sayings, so to speak.
Yeah, we can't quite like check our work, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that was some of the Zen masters that came after the big literary ones. That was some of their comments. They were like, look, that's too much. Let the people think a little bit.
Yeah.
God bless Yanwu. You know, he tried his best. You know, he did such a good job of trying to lead people to places without giving it away, and then predicting what they might think is going on, and then like trying to cut that out from under them, but all through the written word, so you don't. Now, forget the case. Just imagine like if you're a Zen master and your idea, and you're just say you're a great teacher, and your idea is to really figure out how the student is thinking and kind of listen to what he's saying and respond exactly to what he's saying so that you really get your message across. Well, then trying to do that same exact thing through the written word, now having to predict your first, what you're going to be trying to do is lead people to a certain way, so then you narrow down your possible states that the student can be in, and then you're going to try to predict where your student has landed and then write that in, right? So you get this really weird disjunct, like, you know, writing poetic prose of the Blue Glyph record, because I think they're really trying to emulate the lifestyle of really getting to the student as opposed to just putting information down.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's definitely hard to get people to read things because more people read now than ever. No one reads these books. But I like the idea that I was going to compare what you were saying to writing a narrative or a novel or something like that. You're kind of leading someone through something, and you can respond to what you imagine they're expecting in the narrative, and then making a very compelling narrative by being unique. Zen masters tend to do this thing, especially the BCR, where they're responding to narratives, they're creating a narrative, and then they're responding to the narratives they're creating. So it's this weird metagame where they're not actually drawing a thread. They're constantly responding to a thread that's not there. It's very bizarre.
Well put. And they talk about, you know, this was a question that put the hook down, and this was, you know, etc.
Right. Yeah.
To get the person to react, to see if the person will react X way.
Yeah.
Right. And he's ready if he does, and if he doesn't, then he's ready for the other thing. Right. And we get that kind of praise from the Zen masters to a lot of the people in the stories, like, oh, he can react however way, you know, he's ready for whatever, etc. To bring it to this case, you know, it kind of goes along with what we got here. Yanwu, even though this is one of those singular cases, which is different than the ones we were just talking about with all the commentary and the specific written stuff, this still is probably one of the best examples of cases that do it within the case, right? He says, well, even what I just said has not quite made it.
Yeah.
And then he says, well, as long as it benefits people.
Yeah, like
it may be okay.
Yeah. I thought that's why I wanted to talk about that line, because it's such a like sigh in a way. It's like, well, I don't even know how to talk about this. As long as it benefits people.
It may be okay.
Yeah.
It may be.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of like reaction to things, that kind of in the first part where it says there's nothing whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching, I find the last sentence of that quote really compelling, which is, if this is the case, nothing will be the Buddhist teaching and nothing will not be. And it's interesting how the first one is, it's just like, it's a statement, like a fact. There is nothing whatsoever that does not explain the Buddhist teaching. Also, if that is true.
Yeah.
So even when he's making this like solid claim.
So it's a limit it shows the limit of language in that when you state thing like that. To state what he wanted to state, he had to overstep, truth-wise. This is this, because we don't have enough things. Programming has more informational operations you can do to things that other people know about, so you can communicate using those shared algorithms. But these algorithms aren't in the language. So he just says x equals y, even though equals isn't the thing he needs to do. He just needs to communicate x equals y. But if x does like fully equal y, for sure, then this is implied. So he implies that he's not sure that x equals y, but he's still trying to express something he is sure of, even though the statement isn't, because the statement doesn't illustrate what he's trying to get across. He's trying to enlighten you or whatever, right? He's trying to explain whatever he's trying to do, and it's not coming across 100% precisely.
Yeah. I also think that last line, if that's true, then there's, a Buddhist teaching like doesn't even exist in a way.
If it is the case, nothing will be a teaching and nothing will not be.
It's like doesn't even apply the notion of Buddhist teaching. Like it doesn't even get off the ground.
Which is, we'll bring it right back to Wangbo. There are no, right?
Yeah.
There are no Zen teachers.
Right. There's no Buddhist teaching, which is kind of funny in a collection by a master.
Oh, well, why the fuck do you put on your robes?
Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Yunmen comments on that, like you guys already brought up already. Even what I just said has not quite made it. So even all of that other stuff, even saying like it doesn't even get off the ground, the notion of a Buddhist teaching, even though there's nothing that doesn't explain the Buddhist teaching, even that doesn't quite make it.
And then, well, as long as it benefits people, it may be okay. I often wonder if people think of this literature as like I do, but these were like, this was a real dude who was like, I don't know. It's like, you can read these pithy statements and stuff, and you think, okay, so that's a clever, a clever thing, but whoever wrote it down, or the people in the case. Actually, we have pretty good evidence that Yunmen was like everything. A lot of stuff he said is what he actually did and said. But, we have a real person saying, well, when he's teaching like a quote unquote religion, he's giving a sermon or teaching, or, let's just say he was like giving like a math class, a tutor or something, he says, it may be okay. I'm not sure about any of this. To be on the pulpit and be able to say that. It's different.
Yeah.
It's different, and it's more than just a literary trick. It's an intentional part of the narrative.
Yeah, he keeps giving it back to you. Gives you a declarative statement and says, I don't know. Gives you another one and says, well, you got to make up your own mind. And maybe just be pragmatic about it.
Speaking of religion, there was this this definition of religion I came across, and I can't remember the philosopher who came up with it. I think it was Stephen Dunning, who is a religious philosopher, and he basically said that religions have two things that they're part of. One is an aspect where it gathers a community together, and they would have a shared set of principles or moral principles, and those would be around that community. And the other aspect is it divides the sacred from the profane. But if we take that definition there, where it's making a distinction between the sacred and the profane, as being something that this philosopher is saying would define a religion, this teaching would not be a religion. There is nothing whatsoever that doesn't explain the Buddhist teaching. There's no sacred and profane there. And if we were to take the notion of unifying a community around principles, that would also fail here in this context with Yunmen.
Right. So I really like what you're saying. But I'm a little angry because those are like literally the two things I've come up with how to when I'm looking at Zen as a religion, like what makes a religion? It has to have X and Y. And I swear to God, those things came right out of my brain from sitting down and thinking about them. So I'm kind of angry. I put it a little differently. The one is the spiritual, right? So it has to have some sort of spiritual, some sort of oogly doogly, which is sometimes soft and sometimes hard. Like it's not always ghost shit or gods and stuff. But then it also has to pass. And this is how I said it. You said, kind of a gathering, a community, or that philosopher rather. But I was kind of saying that it has to pass on a structured set of beliefs, right? Or something that can be pinpointed and passed on and followed and built around. Which is very adjacent things there. And as you said, we don't have either of those things. The separation, that we don't have the spiritual as different from the physical,
right?
Natural, or however you want to say that. And we don't have a doctrine, basically, a set of beliefs that are passed on, or as you say, are kind of given throughout in communities built around. And some people might bring up things like gods, like sometimes they talk about gods and stuff, although they don't really do it that much, but they do. But really, I mean, we have them using like kind of folklore and religious concepts as like in the stories and stuff. They never, and sometimes they'll say like, you'll go to hell if you don't try to be enlightened enough. They don't say it exactly like that, but you might find something like that.
For sure.
Yeah, those, but a belief in ghosts is not a religion. If I set up the ghost as something and then, built some sort of doctrine around the ghost, that would be different. But if a Zen master believed that there was a hell, that does not automatically equal a set of principles. It's just much more nuanced than that. But there's that caveat. But yeah, for the most part, from this case and most of the Zen master cases, we don't see them setting up principles or separating the spiritual.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if, how do I put this again? When Kevin, you said it doesn't match any of the criteria for.
Well, this guy's.
Yeah, which is fine.
Yeah.
Again, earlier I talked about how, Zen masters come up here and they give you a declarative statement and then they're kind of like, well, I don't know. And so there's this weird, suddenly there's a Zen master who I can depend on and who's wise. And then suddenly whatever I was seeing there, this pillar of wisdom is suddenly gone and I don't know what to rely on anymore. I guess what I'm getting at is if there is no sacred and profane in Zen and there's nothing to exactly grab onto, and yet we keep talking about it. What the hell are we what are we talking about? Is it nihilism? These kind of things that get brought up with Zen. Where's the value? Does Zen reject value?
I don't think so, because I think the rejection would be like saying it isn't, which is that line, one should not assert when one speaks it is the Buddhist teaching, and that when one doesn't speak it isn't. I mean, that itself would be a type of belief that you would be asserting. And a rejection of something, like you just said, would be a belief to reject it.
Right. Okay.
So I think even that wouldn't be it.
So James, is your question, what are you doing, what are we doing, or what should one be doing? Right. So I think the impetus kind of behind that question is often like, I'm excited about this and I want to tell other people about this. That gets kind of confused with like the proselytization that happens when you believe something to be true. Right. So if we can't find, if it's not a religion, you've disappeared the proselytizing, right? You can't evangelize the thing because there's no set principles to evangelize. That goes away, and then you're just left with your excitement. Then you're just left with like, okay, this is cool. I want to tell people about it.
Right. I like that. I was thinking while you're saying that you no longer are relying on principles to supply a reason for your excitement. All you're left with, as you said, is the excitement. And it kind of makes you realize that you might not necessarily need the principles to justify why you're excited about Zen. You're left with the action, if you will. You're in it. Yeah.
Which goes back to striking the bell.
Right. Yeah.
Beating the drum. I think that's what I find compelling about that line. Striking the drum, striking the bell, beating the drum. I think that's related to what you guys were just saying. Like you just have the excitement, not a belief for the excitement or a reason for the excitement or justification or any of that stuff. It's all like deflated. You're just striking the drum. Well, I think circling back to the metaphor of sound, there's this beautiful quote by Wittgenstein who says, a word, like hearing a word is like it's like striking a key on the keyboard of the imagination, as if your imagination is a piano and then something just hits the key on the piano. I think that analogy is beautiful. And I think the notion of something like, the sound striking a key in the mind, it's just immediate and it's there. There isn't like a belief or some knowledge that the keyboard is striking the sound. There's just the sound. That's some of the content that I get when I see something like striking the bell or beating the drum.
Yeah, it reminds. I don't know which case it is, but it's like, does the sound go to the ear, or does the ear go to the sound? Isn't that a case? Yeah, and so, that's a koan in itself.
Even everything we just said isn't quite it. Hasn't quite made it.
As long as it benefits people, which, if it did, give us 5 stars.
Right? Yep.
And if it didn't, also give us 5 stars. That
5
way
stars, as Dan says, we can see it.
Yeah.
Then we'll definitely know for sure.
Yeah. Otherwise we won't see it. So please do that.
You can also head over to the R Not Zen subreddit.
We'll see the comments there. So if you have suggestions or questions, we'll pop in from time to time. We'll try to address them. Hit us up on our social media things. I don't know what those are. Twitter.
OnlyFans.
Only fans know this. Only fans of the podcast know this.
Yeah, follow us on OnlyFans and Fans Only.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Not Zen, where we talk about Zen, whatnot, and occasionally Brian's awesome haircut. I think you look really good. He looks
22
You
pounds.
look young. Yeah, dude, you look much younger. You're looking good, dude. I gotta say. I want to, I don't want to say I would have sex with you, but.
Well, that's a given.
Yeah.
But would you say it though?
I would, yeah. Well, anyway, this was Jim, your host.
That's at work, not entirely out of work actor.
This is Brian. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm not as handsome. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Kevin. Striking the bell.
That's the loudest butt plug I've ever heard, man.
All sex toys come with a mandatory bell.
Yeah.
It's important.
Where you're at.
This was Jim. I don't know if I said my name.
You did.
Okay. All right.